Think about the last time you saw a child playing. Really playing, completely absorbed, unreachable. Now consider that for most of the 20th century, historians told us medieval children never did that. That childhood as an actual experience didn't exist before the modern era. That medieval parents looked at their young the way farmers look at livestock, useful when large enough and mourned with appropriate brevity when lost. Philippe Ariès wrote it in 1960, Centuries of Childhood, hugely influential, endlessly cited, and, as it turns out, largely wrong. Here's what the evidence actually shows about children in medieval Europe between 500 and 1300 CE. What they did when they woke up, what they ate, what they learned, who taught them, when they played and when they worked, what their parents felt when they died, and they died constantly, and what's still sitting in museum storage right now that tells a story completely at odds with the version you've probably absorbed. The myth of the missing medieval childhood is one of the most persistent in popular history. Time to take it apart. In 1960, a French historian named Philippe Ariès published a book that changed how people thought about children. His argument was stark. Medieval society had no concept of childhood. Children, he claimed, were treated as small adults from the moment they could walk. No transition period, no protected space, no awareness that a 7-year-old might need something different from a 30-year-old. The book was persuasive, cited everywhere. For decades, anyone writing about medieval family life referenced Ariès the way you'd reference gravity. The problem is that his primary evidence was medieval art, the way children are depicted in manuscripts and paintings, adult faces, adult proportions, small bodies. From this, he concluded that medieval artists, and therefore medieval society, simply couldn't perceive children as a distinct category of human being. Medieval artists also painted horses that looked structurally impossible and churches that defied geometry. Artistic convention, not sociological evidence, explains those proportions. Historians have spent the last 50 years dismantling the Ariès thesis piece by piece. The evidence that replaced it comes from wills, court records, church documents, medical texts, and the objects recovered from the earth. What it shows is a society that not only recognized childhood, it organized itself carefully around it. Medieval legal codes distinguish children from adults with precision that surprises people when they encounter it. Anglo-Saxon law set the age of criminal responsibility at 7. Canon law established separate rules for children under that age. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 set specific guidelines for children's religious education. These are not the actions of a society that can't tell the difference between a child and a grown man. The concept existed. The question is what they did with it. The first thing that strikes you about medieval infant care, once you actually look at the records, is how much of it was familiar. Swaddling was universal across medieval Europe, not because parents were indifferent, but because they believed, and contemporary medical texts explain this in detail, that a newborn's limbs needed support while the bones hardened. The 12th century physician and abbess Hildegard of Bingen wrote specific instructions on how tightly to bind, when to release, how to position the head. This is not neglect, it's pediatrics. Wrong by modern standards, but based on observation and intent. Breastfeeding was the norm, and its cessation marked a recognized developmental milestone. Wealthy families employed wet nurses, women paid specifically to feed infants when the mother couldn't or chose not to. The existence of wet nursing as a profession is worth pausing on. It created an entire economic category around infant survival. Someone thought infant survival was worth paying for. The mortality rate was devastating. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries across England and France shows roughly 30 to 40% of children died before reaching their 10th birthday. That number sits in the chest in a particular way. And yet here is where the Ariès argument falls apart completely. Because the same records that document this death rate also document the response to it. Coroners' records from 13th and 14th century England are full of accidents involving children. children falling into wells, drowning in ponds, pulling boiling pots from fires. Each entry represents an inquest. Someone cared enough to record it. Someone treated it as a tragedy worth investigating. Grief doesn't require modernity. It requires love. If you visit the Museum of London, there is a display case containing objects recovered from Thames riverbed mud. Leather balls, wooden tops, small clay marbles, a set of carved wooden figures. These objects date from the 12th and 13th centuries. They are unambiguously toys, and they are everywhere. Archaeological excavations across medieval Europe consistently turn up the same categories of finds in domestic contexts. Miniature versions of adult objects, small pots, tiny tools, scaled-down ceramic animals, alongside objects that have no function except play. Knuckle bones, spinning tops, dolls with articulated limbs. The same children who supposedly had no childhood left behind evidence of childhood in almost every excavated medieval home. Medieval texts discuss children's games with a casual specificity that suggests they were completely ordinary. A 12th century German poem describes a village game historians recognize as an early ancestor of football. William Fitzstephen's description of London, written around 1183, devotes a full passage to children playing on frozen ponds in winter, skating, sliding, competing. He doesn't frame it as unusual. He frames it as what children do. The games had rules, they had seasons, they had social hierarchies and rituals around winning and losing. A modern child dropped into a medieval village would recognize the basic grammar of what was happening, even if the specific games were unfamiliar. Play in medieval society wasn't stolen from children in gaps between work. For younger children, roughly under 7, play was recognized as the primary activity of their days. Work came later, in a graduated way. First you played, then you helped, then you worked. The sequence was understood. 7 was a significant number in medieval thought. Not arbitrary, grounded in medical theory inherited from classical antiquity and reinforced by centuries of observation. Medieval physicians described human development in stages, and the transition at 7 represented the point at which reason was considered capable of functioning. Before 7, dependent, not fully rational, not morally responsible. After 7, trainable, responsible, beginning to enter the adult world of obligation. This had legal teeth. Canon law used 7 as the minimum age for betrothal. Civil law used it as the threshold for criminal responsibility. Guild records used it as the earliest age for apprenticeship entry, and even then, most guilds preferred 12. The guild records of Paris from the 13th century are explicit. A child under that age could assist in a workshop, but formal indenture required the child to be old enough to consent and to understand what they were consenting to. What this means practically? A medieval child under 7 was largely protected from formal obligations. Which doesn't mean they did nothing. Children observe, imitate, assist. A 5-year-old in a peasant household might carry water, chase birds from crops, gather kindling. The tasks were sized to 5-year-old capacity. After 7, expectations shifted. A boy might begin formal apprenticeship or enter service in another household. A girl might begin intensive training in domestic skills. Noble children might be sent to other noble households, a practice that looks alarming by modern standards, but serves specific educational and political functions. Think of it less like abandonment and more like the medieval equivalent of sending a child to a specialist school, except the school was another family's kitchen, and the subjects were how to survive. The assumption is that medieval education was the exclusive property of the nobility and the church. This is partially true and mostly misleading. Formal education, grammar schools, cathedral schools, the earliest universities, was dominated by clergy and wealthy families. The University of Bologna was founded in 1088. Oxford began teaching in recognizable form around 1096. By 1200, Europe had a functioning network of higher learning that would be structurally familiar to anyone who has attended university today. But formal education and actual learning are different things. Most medieval children were educated in ways that left no official record. Craft knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship, years of structured learning with a master craftsman, covering not just technical skills, but the full context of a trade: suppliers, customers, quality standards, professional ethics. A blacksmith's apprentice in 13th century Paris wasn't just learning to hit iron, he was absorbing an entire professional world. Agricultural knowledge passed from parent to child through direct participation. A child who had watched wheat harvested for 6 consecutive years knew things about soil, weather, timing, and yield that couldn't be written down and didn't need to be. The literacy rate was low. Estimates for medieval England range from roughly 10 to 30%, depending on period and region. Literacy is not the same as education. And here is something the popular image consistently gets backwards. The children of skilled craftsmen in medieval cities often received more intensive specialized training than the children of minor nobility, who were mostly learning to manage estates and fall off horses with dignity. The village schoolmaster is a later invention. The education was always there. Let's be precise about what child labor in medieval Europe actually looked like. Because the image most people carry, small children in brutal conditions, indistinguishable from Victorian factories, doesn't match the historical record. For peasant children, work was real and began early. By 8 or 9, a child in an agricultural household was contributing meaningfully to family survival. Tending animals, weeding fields, helping with the harvest, learning to preserve food before winter. This is not a gentle picture. But it existed within a rhythm. Medieval agricultural work was intensely seasonal. The absolute crunch, planting and harvest, lasted weeks, not months. Between those peaks came winter. Medieval winter, for children, was considerably less demanding than summer. The same sources that document child labor during August describe something much closer to rest during January. The harvest itself was a community event in which children participated alongside adults, not as a punishment, but as a celebration with its own rituals. Contemporary accounts describe harvest festivals with specific roles for children: carrying water, gleaning leftover grain after the main harvest was cut, taking part in the songs and games that accompanied the work. Urban children had different rhythms entirely. A merchant's child in a medieval town lived closer to a modern middle-class child's experience than almost anyone in the popular imagination. School in the morning, trade training in the afternoon, evenings in a household dense with neighbors and the social life of a walled city. The brutal version of medieval childhood existed. Orphans had it. Children in famine years had it. Children of the destitute rural poor had it during catastrophic harvests. It wasn't the default. It was the catastrophic exception. Here is the fact that consistently surprises people who study medieval childhood seriously. Medieval society had specific laws protecting children from sexual abuse, and those laws were enforced. This is the part nobody tells you, because it disrupts the comfortable narrative of medieval barbarity on one side and modern enlightenment on the other. The age of consent under canon law varied by region and period. But the principle that children require protection from adult predation was not a modern invention. Ecclesiastical courts across medieval Europe prosecuted cases of child sexual abuse with consistency from at least the 12th century onward. The legal infrastructure wasn't perfect, no legal infrastructure is, but it existed, it was used, and it produced documented outcomes. Medieval medical texts show something equally unexpected. A clear awareness that children process trauma differently from adults and require different care. Not in modern psychological language, but 13th century medical writers describing the treatment of children who had experienced violence or grief show recognizable intent. The understanding that a child's distress is a distinct problem requiring a distinct response. The 14th century mystic Julian of Norwich, writing about her own childhood, describes experiences of fear and spiritual confusion that read as recognizably adolescent in ways that still manage to surprise. The reason this matters is not that medieval society was secretly advanced. It's that the impulse to protect children from harm is not a recent invention. It is an old human impulse. With terrible exceptions. The exceptions were real and should not be minimized, but treating them as the norm has done something quietly harmful. It allows us to feel that protection of children is a modern achievement, when it is much, much older than that. Medieval wills are full of children, not just as heirs, in the personal sense. Medieval people who made wills often wrote them in ways that give you an unexpected window into the emotional texture of their lives. A 13th century English merchant's will specifies that his daughter, aged 9, should receive his best silver cup, the one they drank from together on feast days. A French noblewoman's will from 1289 asks that a small embroidered cloth be placed in her daughter's coffin because the child had loved it. These are not legal formalities. These are people trying to extend their presence past death towards specific children they loved. Medieval poetry is blunter. Laments for dead children exist across every European language, and they are not abstract theological exercises. They are angry, specific, personal. A 12th century Irish poem, Mourning a Son, describes the silence in a house where a child used to make noise. A Middle English lyric from the 14th century describes a father reaching for his child in sleep and finding nothing. Infant mortality didn't make death unfelt. In some ways, the opposite. When you know something can be lost, you pay attention to it differently. Archaeological evidence from medieval children's graves adds one more layer. Children were buried with objects, toys, food, small personal items, in ways that suggest ceremony and ongoing attachment. A 10th century Viking child's grave excavated in York contained a small wooden cart, clearly placed deliberately. Someone chose that object. Someone thought he would want this. That impulse does not require the word childhood to exist. It requires a different word entirely. Something that receives almost no attention in popular accounts of medieval childhood: the interior life. Medieval children grew up inside a cosmological framework that made the world simultaneously more terrifying and more legible than our own. God was real, present, and directly interested in their behavior. Saints were personal protectors, invoked by name. The priest who performed your baptism was completing a ritual with immediate supernatural consequences. This was not background noise. It was the structure through which every experience was filtered. Whether you believe any of this is irrelevant to understanding what it was like to be a child inside it. Medieval children did not experience the world as secular. They experienced it as comprehensively inhabited by forces that cared about them specifically. Medieval penitential literature, guides written for confessors, includes specific sections on handling children's confessions. What sins were medieval children committing? Mostly the familiar ones: lying, taking things, being unkind to siblings. The guide's advice is often gentle, specifically acknowledging that children are children and must be treated accordingly. The saints' lives written for young audiences, a genre that flourished from the 11th century onward, consistently feature child protagonists in states of fear, confusion, and gradual understanding. They are not inspirational pamphlets. They are, in a strange way, children's books. Stories about young people navigating an overwhelming world with inadequate information and eventually finding their way through. Frightening, certainly, but also comprehensible. In a world where children died at rates that are genuinely hard to absorb, giving a child a framework in which death was not the end was not manipulation. It was an attempt to make survival possible. Noble childhood was a different world, not always a better one. The children of the aristocracy faced expectations that would register as extraordinary pressure today. A boy born into a noble family in 10th century France was, by 7, already being observed for the qualities he would need as an adult: courage, self-control, the ability to sit still for hours of religious instruction, writing without falling off and looking weak. Any visible failure was noted, discussed, corrected. Formal education for noble boys often began around 7, either in a cathedral school or in the household of another lord, the system of fosterage that moved children between powerful families for political and educational reasons. It looks from the outside like children being traded. The reality was more textured. Many of the most detailed medieval descriptions of adult male friendship describe relationships formed during this period of shared fosterage. Two boys sent to the same household, navigating the same demanding environment together, formed bonds that lasted decades. Medieval literature is saturated with this: the lord and his childhood companion, the knight and his foster brother. The word sworn brotherhood appears repeatedly in contexts that trace back to shared adolescent experience. Noble girls were educated primarily for marriage and household management, which in practice meant learning to read, manage accounts, supervise servants, negotiate with suppliers, and administer estates in their husband's absence. Because husbands were absent constantly for war or politics or trade. The wife of a medieval lord was not a decoration; she was an executive. By 12 or 13, noble children were already being positioned for their adult roles. Betrothals were common at this age. The childhood window was short, and everyone knew it. Short didn't mean unloved, it meant expensive, and therefore visible, and therefore documented in ways that peasant childhoods often were not. There is a medieval illustration in the British Library's collection showing a group of children, you can tell by their size relative to the tree they're gathered around, playing some kind of game. It's from a 13th century manuscript. One of the children is running. One appears to be laughing, or at least the artist thought that was worth capturing. We've spent a long time telling ourselves that childhood is something we invented. The people in the past were too brutal, too surrounded by death, too practical to let children simply be children. It's a flattering story about the present. It makes modernity feel like an achievement. The evidence doesn't support it. Medieval parents buried their children with toys. Medieval lawyers wrote rules to protect them. Medieval poets wrote about missing them with a precision that has nothing antique about it. What medieval childhood lacked, compared to ours, was length, security, the absence of disease, enough food. These are not small absences. The children who didn't survive to play on those frozen London ponds were real, and their loss was real, and the world that failed to prevent it deserved to change. But the love that surrounded those children while they were alive was not waiting to be invented. If content like this matters to you, history that resists the easy version in both directions, your support is genuinely what makes it possible to keep going. Subscribe if you haven't. It means more than the number suggests.